Hey everybody, welcome to Python 101. In this class, what we're going to be doing is we're going to learn the basics of coding in Python. Python is a great language to learn coding from scratch, so if you don't know anything about coding, this is the perfect language to start with. Python is very simple. It doesn't use any words that it doesn't have to use, that you don't need. So it's very straightforward, very simple. However, there is a bit of a learning curve. However, I'm always here for you guys. If you are struggling with anything, just reach out to me and we can figure it out from there. Now, today we're going to be focusing on chapter 2, and this is just the basics: input, processing, output. So in this lecture, we're going to learn how to display anything on our screen, how to read input from the keyboard, and so on. Now, let's dive in. Now, before we get to actual coding, before we get to actually writing the program, there is a couple of steps that you need to be aware of. And the first one is designing your program. So, before you even put your fingers on the keyboard and start typing your code, you have to design and think about the program that you're going to be writing. There's such thing as we call program development cycle, and it consists of a couple of steps. So the first one is going to be designing your program, then you're going to write your code, then you're going to correct any syntax errors that appear in your code. Your compiler will actually tell you if you have any syntax errors, so those are pretty easy to fix. Then you're going to test your program and see if it runs correctly, and if it doesn't, you're going to correct any logic errors that exist inside of your code. Now, when it comes to the very first step, which is designing your program, most people believe it to be the most important step, the most crucial step in coding as a whole. Because later on, you're going to be working with customers, you're going to be working with people, with companies. It doesn't really matter. You're going to be working with users that need something from you. And you have to know what the customer wants and what the program is supposed to be doing for the customer. Now, you can achieve it in many different ways, but the most simple one, just ask them questions. When you get out of this program and when you go into the professional life, you will have to communicate with your user. You will have to know what exactly they want. Just make sure to ask a lot of questions and make sure that you fulfill every single need that your customer might have for the program that you're designing. Just don't slack off on this step. Just make sure that you put as much thought to this process, to this part specifically of your program, as you can. Now let's do a little recap of PLD 101 and let's go back to algorithm. So algorithm, what that is a set of well-defined logical steps that you must take as a coder to perform a certain task. In this case, that certain task is writing a program for the user, and whenever you have a task that needs to be done, the best approach is to break it down into smaller parts. So break it down into series of steps, and after that you can create an algorithm for you as a coder that's going to list all of the steps that you need to take to fulfill whatever's in front of you, whatever problem's in front of you, to solve it. Now, another recap about pseudocode. Pseudocode is fake code, so it is not written in any of the languages, any programming languages. It's just written in plain, straight English, and it is used to just create a model of your program. It's used to make sure that whenever you show that pseudocode to the user, that the user can understand what your program is going to be doing. Flowcharts, another good thing that helps with designing your program. Flowcharts is a little diagram that's gonna follow a certain pattern of steps that are in your program. So you're just gonna show on paper, basically, you're gonna physically show how the program is gonna flow, what the program is supposed to be doing. Here is an example of a flowchart. You already seen it in PLD 101, so I'm not gonna spend too much time on it, but this is the flowchart right here. Now, let's move on to the actual coding. So, there are a couple of things that you need to know. Typically, when we work with our computers as coders, your computer will perform three-step process. Your computer will receive input, and by input, I mean just any data that your program will receive while it's running. Then after that, you're gonna do something with that input. Either you're gonna store it somewhere in a database, or you're gonna perform some calculations. If you need to calculate, for example, taxes of somebody, your program can do that. And after that, you're gonna produce some sort of output. So either you're gonna show something to the user, you're gonna print something for them, doesn't really matter. Your program is gonna produce some output. And output is just data that's coming out of your program. Here is actual code in Python. So in Python, to display any sort of output, you have to use the print function. And you do it, it's fairly simple. All that you need to do, let's look at it right here. All that you need to do, you have to put the keyword print. Then you're gonna open your parentheses, and you're gonna open the quotation marks right here. Quotation marks can either be single or double. It doesn't really matter in Python. And then inside of those quotation marks, you're gonna put whatever you want to produce on the screen. In this case, we're printing hello world. And as you can see right here, hello world is printed after we run our little program. So nothing too complicated. Just the keyword print, parentheses, quotation marks, whatever is inside of them is going to be displayed on your screen. Now, a couple of more coding terms. So, function, what function is in Python is just code that has already been written before you, for you to use, and it's going to perform some sort of operation. So when I said print function, that just means that this function has already been pre-written and it does some action for you. In this case, print is going to display something on the screen. Now, argument, what argument is data that you give to a function. In our example with hello world, the actual string of hello world was our argument. Whatever we printed on the screen was our argument. The way that statements in a program execute are usually from top to bottom, so you don't have to worry about that. Top to bottom, whatever comes first is going to be executed first. As you can see here, another example, we are printing programming is fun. And since we run our program from top to bottom, this is exactly the way that it is printed. As you can see, programming on one line is on the second line, fun on the other line. Strings. All right, let's talk about strings. We talked a little bit about it in PLD 101, however, let's recall. A string is a sequence of characters that you use when you are coding. So anything that consists of characters, we call that a string. Now, string literal is a string that's going to appear inside of your code. Now, in Python, as I mentioned before, it must be enclosed in either single or double quotation marks. And you can also enclose them in triple, doesn't really matter. I would recommend just use single or double, don't make your life harder by using triple quotes. Comments, another thing that exists in Python and in other various programming languages. Comments are just little pieces of information that you put inside of your program that usually those comments explain what your program is doing. Now, Python interpreter is the actual program that's going to run your code. And if you put a comment begins with a hashtag character or pound character. They will be ignored by your Python interpreter. What that means is they are not going to disrupt your flow of code. Your Python will just ignore it as a whole, pretend that it doesn't exist. Because usually those comments just explain what your program is doing or what that part of code specifically is doing. Variables is another recap from PLD 101. Variables usually represent something that we store in memory of our computer. So we have different data types such as string, integer, float, decimal, we covered them in PLG 101. Those are stored in variables. So anything that you want to be stored when you're writing your code, those things will be stored in variables. Now another thing is assignment statement. Assignment statement is when you create your variable and you assign some data to it. As you can see, this is just a simple example. Variable equals whatever you want it to be equal. In this case, we have a variable called h and it equals 29. Assignment operator is just your equal sign. Another example, the first line right here, we have temperature equals 75, so we assign 75 to our variable temperature. Cost equals 87.99. 87.99 is assigned to the cost variable. And then we have a string Monty that is assigned to the variable called name. So all of these values, 75, 87, Monty, all of those are stored inside of our variables. Now, whenever you assign some values to your variable, the variable needs to be on the left side and your value needs to be on the right side of the equal sign, as you have seen in the previous examples. You cannot do it the other way, so just be mindful of that when you're working with variables. Now, you can also pass any kind of variable to a function. As you can see, we used print with hello world. Instead of hello world, you can put any kind of variable inside of that function and it will be printed on your computer. However, you can only use your variables if some value is already assigned to it. If your variable is empty, you will have errors and those are not usable. So just make sure if you want to use a variable that you have some value assigned to it. Also in Python, you can assign multiple values to multiple variables at the same time in one statement. As you can see here, x, y, z, they're all separated by commas. These are the names of our variables. They equal to 0, 1, and 2. Our values are also separated by a comma. So what that means, this is the same as doing this. X equals 0, y equals 1, z equals 2. This, we call it multiple assignment. You do not have to do this. If it's easier for you to do it on separate lines, you can totally do that. I'm just showing you that you can do it another way too. Now, there are some rules for whenever you're naming your variables in Python. They cannot be a Python keyword, and what those are those, remember I showed you print, so print is a Python keyword, so you cannot name any variables print, and there are a couple of more other Python keywords that exist. You're gonna get familiar with them the more we go through this course. Now, your variable name cannot contain any spaces. First character must either be a letter or an underscore. After first character, you can use anything you want, such as letters, digits, or underscores, but you cannot use any special characters. And your variable names are case sensitive. And what that means, if you have a name of a variable that is all lowercase and you have a variable that is all uppercase, even though they are the same word, they will still be considered different variables. And obviously the most important one is your variable name. It should reflect what it's storing. So for example, if you're storing somebody's name, don't call that variable age, right? That's just common sense. So if you're storing somebody's name, you have to call that variable name. If you want to print multiple items in Python, you can also do that. The only thing that you need to do is separate those items by a comma when you pass them as arguments. So nothing too complicated here. When it comes to data types, we have a couple of them in Python. So int stands right here, int stands for integer. So any number that is a whole number is called an integer. Then float stands for any real number. So that just means any number that has a decimal in it. For example, 9.0 will be a float, considered a float in Python. However, if you just put 9 without anything after, that will be considered an integer. And string, str, stands for strings, which are just sequence of characters. Now, whenever you create your variable, it doesn't have to stay with that specific data type. And that is just something that exists in Python. Other languages are not like that. So in Python, for example, we have our x equal to 99 at first. And then if we want our variable x to reference a string, all that we have to do is just reassign that variable to whatever we want it to have. In this case, it's take me to your leader. Example of that. Right here we have an example, name equals input what is your name. So what's going to happen, what is your name is going to be displayed on your screen, and after that you will be prompted to type your name or whatever you want to type, and that is going to be stored inside of the name variable. If you want to read numbers with your input, you have to specify that you want your input function to read numbers, because input function by itself will always return a string. Now, to specify that you want to read a number, all you have to do is just specify either you want an integer, which stands for which is int, or float if you want to read a real number. Now let me show you an example of that right here. We have number equals integer, as you can see, integer, input, enter a number. So first we're taking the input and then we're converting that input to an integer, and we're storing that number as an integer. And here is the same example but with float instead of an integer. So as you can see, fairly simple. It's the same idea of taking an input from the user. However, at the very beginning, we're specifying that we want the result to be a float. Now, this is where I'm going to end the part 1. In part 2, we're going to talk about some math calculations and a couple of more topics.